Well, good evening, everyone. I'm honored and excited and a bit flabbergasted to be here tonight with all of you, but especially with our esteemed author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, a writer that I look up to personally and have many of your dog-eared books in my home and many of your articles saved. Yes.
You didn't tell me that.
Yes.
Wow.
And especially your Kanye essay, but we're not going to talk about that. Maybe later.
We can talk about Kanye.
Okay.
We don't have to just talk about the book. I mean, we can talk about Kanye if you want.
I think that was one of the reader questions, so I'll save Kanye for the end. But I was absolutely blown away by this profound and beautiful book, which combines my two favorite flood subjects, African American history and literature, and it read like poetry to me, weaving gorgeous sentences with lyricism and work songs and a cinematic page-turning plot. And before we get started with the interview, I just want to point out that I think it's kind of fantastic and interesting that we're sitting in a theater named after James K. Polk, our 11th president, who bought and sold and broke up families and slaves. But I think it's interesting to be—
From the White House, right?
Yes.
Yeah, like actually from the White House.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting to be here with a book about slavery and a theater that's paying homage to a slave-owning president.
Wow.
So I think it's really powerful to have this discussion tonight. So speaking of plantations, I recently saw your interview with Gayle King on CBS this morning where you were at Monticello and kind of walking around the property. And you both were standing kind of at an exhumed site, kind of looking at some of the artifacts, and you had found some marbles. And I wanted to pull a quote from the book on page 22 where Hiram is kind of talking about Lockless, and he says, "And then we were past the wheat fields, crossing the green lawn, and through the flower garden, until I saw, elevated on a small hill, the big house of Lockless, shining like the sun itself. When we were closer, I took in stone columns, the portico, and the fanlight of the entrance. It was all so magnificent." And I've heard you say that you had a big influence on Lockless from Monticello, and in the interview you said something kind of interesting, and that you were kind of buzzing after you were there, and you were kind of had this energy and you wanted to write. I'd love to know, what were you buzzing with? Did you feel kind of the slave stories kind of coming with you? Did you feel possessed when you went back to write? Like, what was kind of happening when you were there doing that research?
Well, that's a great question. Nobody's asked like that. And I've been on tour for like 6 weeks now, so that's a compliment. What did I feel? I don't know. I think like it is, obviously, when you're working on something like this, you spend a lot of time reading, okay? And you can get some of what it was like to be an enslaved person, to be tasked, as we say in the book, to be an enslaver, to be, quality, as we say in the book. But, I mean, it's just nothing like being there. You know what I mean? Like, you walk into an actual replica of an enslaved cabin. And it's just the littlest stuff that strikes you, like, like the window, you know what I mean? In a lot of enslaved dwellings in Virginia, they have like these crawl spaces where, I guess it's not a crawl space, it's more like a storage space. So if you could pick up the floor like this basically, or a piece of it, like a square of it, and enslaved people would hide their precious things there. The fact that a lot of these ones, at least at Monticello, would have a loft, you know what I mean, where you could, a child, you can imagine, like, actually, as I literally did imagine, crawl up and, like, sleep in the loft or store things in the loft. This sounds like small, insignificant, just the treatise, but in fact, it's quite important. So if you don't have those little details, you can't construct a human being. You just have this kind of automaton that says slave.
Yeah.
And if you don't sort of file that down, if you don't detail it, if you don't give it the richness that it deserves, you risk committing almost a second atrocity. Because you're writing about people whose humanity was stripped away.
Yeah.
And if you're not writing with that kind of energy that I felt, or I think I've felt, you risk stripping it again in the literature. Yeah. You see, because they don't have all of the little things that make us, and make us human beings. Yeah. And so I think when I laughed, I could just feel it. You know what I mean? Like I could feel them. I could feel it, and I was very, very anxious to record that feeling, onto the page.
Yeah, you did beautifully.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It reminds me of kind of like a tuning fork, like you were kind of struck by that soil, and that kind of is made prevalent in the book. In Tennessee, we're no stranger to plantations, and I know that you went to many different plantations for your research. But so often,
I came here for research. I came to Tennessee for research.
which plantations?
So I actually didn't get to the when at that point. So Water Dance has this whole backstory where it actually started in the Civil War, and I went on this Civil War tour when I was here, and I believe I know we started over in Memphis and we made our way here. And I think I went down to Mississippi to Shiloh, a bunch of Fort Donelson, a bunch of places that where Grant had fought. Grant spent a lot of time, obviously campaigning here. And while I didn't make it to plantations, I made it to quite a few small towns where the memory of the Civil War is alive. It was probably the first time in my life I encountered people that actually carried the Confederate flag. It was like a big thing for them. You know what I mean? Like a huge, and not even like in the North where you find people with a Confederate flag just as a kind of fuck you. You know what I mean? But no, literally.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was ancestral to them. It was the first time I actually had conversations with people who, were part of the sons of Confederate veterans. I can remember one night, Francis, sorry to distract.
No, you're good.
But I remember one night, I'm on this tour, and I believe I was the only black person on the tour. And we would go to a different place each day, and we ended up in some small town, and we had a great dinner and everything. Food was exceptional. And these guys come in, these Civil War reenactors who the tour has hired, and they all have Confederate flag, all of them. You know what I mean? Now, you can look at it as kind of part of the show, you know what I mean? And they were going to do this whole thing where they were going to fire a cannon, right? And I said to her, I don't think I'm going to stick around for that. And I didn't make a big thing out of it. I'm protesting. I'm just not going to stick around. It's okay. I get it. You do you. That's all good. I'm not that type of person. You know what I mean? You do you. I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to my hotel room and do me.
Yeah.
And that's all good. And the next day, man, I got, into the, the car, the caravan that we were in, and everyone just profusely apologized. Like, they were really, really apologetic. But I don't know that they were upset in the sense that, I guess there was some of this, this really, Civil War, we recognize this kind of backwards. But what they were most upset about, I thought this was so beautiful, that they had inconvenienced me. They were upset because they felt like they had been impolite to me. Like I was a guest, and it wasn't even about the history or what the flag meant. It was like a civility thing almost. And it was the most fascinating thing, and my thing in those moments actually is to be the writer and just sort of watch and just sort of listen. I actually don't, even though I'm argumentative in a lot of my texts, I actually don't do a lot of that in person. Because you're trying to get a sense, again, of people. And that was just such a key observation for me, you know what I mean? And a lot of that actually is in the book, because there are moments where you disagree with people, you find things that people stand for actually appalling.
Yeah.
But even with them, just like this, you have to find those little things that make them human. And I'm sorry, I cut off your question.
No, you're good. In the South, I think we have a type of Southern amnesia and this romanticization of the past. And there's weddings that happen on plantations here, and graduation parties. And,
and Monticello too, by the way.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that this book is invested in the power of kind of looking back. But you just said something that's really interesting, that it's your job to kind of watch, and that's also kind of Hiram's job in the book, is he's constantly watching and recording. And it made me think about the role of the writers, often the role of paying close attention to the world and capturing those details. And I was wondering how much of Hiram is in you, or vice versa, how much of you is in Hiram? What always with fiction, I think there's slices of yourself and of your psyche that you kind of pour into your characters.
A lot. Probably a lot. And I would say there's slices of me in everybody. But obviously the protagonist, the voice, it's not a mistake that, at various points he ends up writing, But yeah, I think that thing about watching probably is a big thing. With my closest friends, I'm probably, pretty loud and gregarious and ha ha ha. But as in a job capacity, as a writer, it really does require you to pull back and just let people talk and let their lives spool out. And, this started for me, and I guess this is the part of me that's really in Hiram. This actually, started for me at a very, very young age. People would tell me things, and I had no idea why they were telling me them. They would just tell me stuff. It would just spill out. You know what I mean? Yeah. I grew up in Baltimore at a really difficult time. And, I'd be in middle school with these, hard-ass dudes, you know what I mean? And they would tell me all of these things. like these, things that they, to preserve their own sort of match, you would think they would not say. I actually think that was like part of how I ended up, being in, journalism, because I found that for whatever reason, if I just sat back, people would entrust me with things,
Story, yeah.
And you can't help but then begin to observe, the little, as I said, contours that, make people. And that's a lot of what Hiram is, doing.
That happens to Hiram again and again. He just sits long enough and he's not talking, and people just start sharing and spilling their story.
Right,
and he's
right.
like, it always happens.
Right.
Like this.
Right. And he doesn't understand why it happens. Yeah.
So since I brought up Gail, I have to bring up her bestie, the Oprah Winfrey. And of course, because we have the same alma mater, TSU. And yes.
It's the second night straight I've been with somebody from an HBCU.
Really?
Yeah, it's a beautiful. I was with Terry Jones last night, from Salon, and so it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
it's great.
And Terry has a great essay of what she did with her Oprah money. It's a really wonderful essay on the cut. So what was it like? Of course, I know you've gotten this several times, but I think it's worth to get that call from Oprah and to have that sticker on your book. I think in another interview you called her kind of the point guard for publishing.
Yeah, she is. By which I mean, like she's a great distributor. You would never, there's nobody else who you would want to be with, you know what I mean, who could, do a better job of just setting you up.
Yeah.
My situation was a little different because I knew that she was relaunching a book club and I knew somebody was going to get picked. And obviously my publisher, my editors were very interested in who that somebody might be. Yeah. And so I would get like these little reports as things would, go. But I still didn't, you know what I mean? Like you can't write a book and think, well, you have one of the old ones. It doesn't have a sticker on it.
Well, I got an early copy before
the
the sticker.
Okay. So you didn't even know. You were like reading this and then you found out it was
Yeah.
an Oprah pick. Okay, all right. That's wild. What'd you think? Were you surprised?
Well, I mean, it's Oprah. Like, I always my dream is to have Oprah, like, the interlacing hands, and she kind of shakes me together.
But I'm saying, like, did you think, like, this feels like an Oprah pick?
Yeah, of course.
So that's the thing. So I'm asking you that because, like, I don't know what that is. Like, I know what it is. Like, I've obviously seen books that she picked, but when it wasn't like you can say, this is the book. Like, even when we were done. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we're done. Oprah's gonna, like, this clearly is right up her alley, And it was only after we picked it that, we started looking back and we were like, oh, right, yeah. Like, there are a lot of things in here that would,
Yeah. I think she's interested in
true.
Ancestry and lineage and,
Yep. And obviously there's a lot of stuff with gender and women, that would ring for her. But it was not a thing that, we were thinking about at the time,
So you started this book in 2009, before Between the World and Me, before the memoir, before all the books that we know you for. And I think a lot of people have asked you why fiction, but really that was your genre from the jump. And really you said that you've kind of been returning to this novel back and forth between each of the books. And so I had kind of a two-part question. What has that 10-year writing journey been like for you? And how has your relationship to the truth changed, toggling from nonfiction to fiction? And what's that interplay for you with that emotional truth that you wanted to convey through this novel?
Wow, can you say that again?
Okay, sorry, that was like probably 7 questions.
No, I just want to give a good answer. I want to give a good answer.
So I'm interested in what that 10-year writing journey was like for you. And
going back and forth.
And like, I'm interested in that toggle because you're going nonfiction to fiction, nonfiction to fiction. And obviously, you're beholden to a type of truth in nonfiction, right? You're beholden to a type of fact. But here, there's an emotional truth that you're investigating. And what is that dilation back and forth? How does one kind of spill out into the other and kind of inform both of those genres that you're kind of straddling between?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think, like this is my first novel. And so, I mean, whatever. And as you mentioned, I started it before Between the World and Me. I mean, I started this 5 years before Between the World and Me was published. So, like, I think maybe people presume that because of the success of that book, some of my other work, that, like, I wouldn't have the same sort of jitters that any sort of first-time novelist has, and that's not true. Because, as I said, I started it before all of that happened. That's the first thing. But the second thing is I just... It's a lot of nonfiction writers that think they have a novel in them. And they publish a novel and then they're quickly abused of that notion. Disabused of that notion. And I was like, man, I just can't be one of those. You know what I'm saying? Like, I can't embarrass myself. Like, whatever happens here, you know what I mean? It doesn't mean everybody has to like it, right? But it can't be like, my God, this dude should just... You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And one of the things that happens is if you experience a level of success, I think, across fields, the great danger is you will be surrounded by people who just blow smoke up your ass. I mean, that's a thing that happens so often. You know what I mean? And so, like, when you have people whose art you love and then they just go off in this direction and you wonder why.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They are surrounded by people who are telling them that they're God. You know what I mean? Anything that they do is great. And so, to be straight with you, after the success that Between the World and Me had, I felt like I was in a very dangerous place. I had this book. I had been working on this book, as I said, by that time for about, so I've been working on it for 6 years. The plot was pretty much set. It's mostly, what it was. But, and I didn't have an editor like this. I didn't have a publisher like this. But there is great incentive when somebody has a name to not so much care about the quality and just put it out. People buy it because it's the name. Mm-hmm. But long term, that's like brand death, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? Because people will eventually figure it out. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so I really wanted, for people who were fans of my nonfiction and careful readers of it, they didn't have to love the book, but they had to be able to say, okay, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I see he's going over here, but he's bringing that same level of rigor and integrity, artistic integrity to it. Yeah. That was really, really important. And I don't know, man. I was scared it wasn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I can remember, like, at one point, this is like when we were working on We Were 8 Years in Power, and I texted my editor, Chris Jackson. I said to him, listen, I'm scared this is going to get lost, and actually it was before that because I hadn't signed a contract with us. I said, I'm scared this is never going to happen. He said, listen, if it don't happen, it wasn't worth it to begin with. Mm. If it's worth it, it'll keep calling you, you'll get back to it, and you will get it where it needs to go. Mm-hmm. So I had several crises of faith, but the main thing was just, as you can see when I was talking about tripping and my fly being open, I have great fear of embarrassing myself. I just don't want to, you know what I mean? I just don't want to embarrass myself, Yeah, which is, by the way, different than trying something artistically and it not working. Mm-hmm. I don't fear failure. You understand what I'm saying? I'm never embarrassed by failing. In comic books, I failed I don't know how many times. Issues I would love to, I wouldn't love to take them back. I'm fine. That's what happens. That's learning. But I was trying my best. You know what I mean? I was doing what I could do.
Yeah. I'm glad you talked about that. Actually, in your essay about Kanye, you talk about kind of the stress of success and what it did to you after Between the World and Me. And I think you compared it to like a wave that kind of overwhelms you and kind of subsumes you. And it's something that I think writers don't talk about often because, of course, you're supposed to be so grateful, right? Right. And, you're not supposed to talk about kind of the stresses of success. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. My follow-up to that is, this is a book of fiction, but it also has some magical realism elements to it, which is kind of entrenched in this kind of Latinx tradition that has to do with kind of political subversion, but also very much tied to origins in Africa and spirituality and thinking about you growing up with comic books and working on Black Panther, hashtag Wakanda forever. Yes. So I'd love for you to discuss kind of, it kind of seems natural that magic would end up in the book, but I'd love for you to talk about, it's not in some imagined future like Wakanda, it's in the deep past. Right.
Well, the first thing was I felt like, part of that is my taste, you know what I mean? But I think bigger than that, when I went back to research and read the narratives of enslaved people, the supernatural is always very, very present in their lives. It's present in Frederick Douglass's life. It's present in Harriet Tubman's life. Like, it's always there. Yeah. And I felt like, in addition to, me being thrilled by the idea, it was an accurate representation of how they experience the world, if that makes sense. And so it felt like a no-brainer to me. I think it strikes, like, people are always surprised by it. But I think maybe that has more to do with how the epic of enslavement has been represented in a lot of our pop culture, actually, than, how people viewed things at the time.
Yeah, it makes me kind of think, we have the phrase black girl magic, but as I was reading the book, so much of that magic comes from having to subsist through white supremacy.
Right.
And that's where, that power is found through the book,
Right.
is through this ancestral trauma. That's the
Right.
trigger, that's the catalyst.
Exactly.
So a major theme of this book is about memory and the power of the story. And it made me think about that kind of Ghanaian idea of Sankofa, that go back and get it, and that we must return and reclaim our past in order to move forward. And this idea that Hiram, that's made manifest in Hiram, that he is a person who watches and records everything, but the one memory he cannot access is his mother being sold. And it made me think about post-traumatic slave syndrome and this kind of concept of, what does that do to a people and our DNA? And why did you want that to kind of be Hiram's kind of origin story?
Because I think it's always things that we don't want to talk about. I mean, when I wrote this, one of the barriers that was apparent to me that I would have to get over is, and you hear this. You're hearing this with Harriet right now. You heard it with 12 years. I don't want to see another film or read another thing about slavery. I'm done. And I get that. I think part of that has to do with the trauma of it. I think another part has to do with, again, how it's been represented in the pop culture. There is a tremendous amount of attention paid to the visceral labors of enslavement. I saw Glory. I don't need to see another 5-minute whipping scene or 2-minute whipping scene or 1 minute or 30. I get it. I got what it was. I understand. And so I think a lot of people, when they're confronted with it, they react in that way. But one of the things that I got from the narratives, and I've said this over and over again, is you read people from the time, and as bad as the torture is, as bad as the being worked is, as bad as the being raped is, all of that's bad. But by far the worst thing is the destruction of black families. And they talk about it. I'm not saying, that's the thing that highlights, everything, you know what I mean? The story that I think about a lot that, was ringing through in this one, and it was really ringing through, in the character Thana, is Drew Gilpin Faust in her book, This Republic of Suffering. It's a book about how death how the Civil War changed how Americans saw death itself, because there was so much dying. And there's a moment when a woman who's a mistress of a plantation, she is grieving for her, 6, 7, 8, it's a lot, sons she sent off to fight in the Civil War for the Confederacy, and all of them are dead. And she's sitting there, and she's grieving, and she's crying, and there's this enslaved woman who has clearly served her for years, who's there ostensibly to comfort her. But what the enslaved woman says is, now, missus, you and I are even. And she says that because this woman has sold off all of her children. And I thought about that a lot. You know what I mean? Like, it was the family thing that got that woman.
Yeah.
And that comes across so very often. And so I really saw an opportunity to take us back and to say, maybe we missed something. Like, we think we know, but I think there's a thing that we actually don't know, something that we've forgotten. And I know we've forgotten because I think about how we talk about ourselves and how we talk about our families. And this constant discourse of black people ain't this, black people ain't that, black fathers ain't shit, black, you know what I mean? Like, it's a constant thing that we don't really care about each other, and we don't really care about our families. And I would argue that the history points to something else, or that the history says otherwise. And so one of the things I was really trying to get to in this book is the extreme lengths that people will go to reconstruct, rebuild, maintain, support, ensure the survival of their families, and the extreme degrees that black people went to, in this country. Historian Eric Foner, he talks about how well into the early 20th century, you could pick up black newspapers in this country, and you would see ads from black people who had survived the epoch of enslavement, searching for relatives who had been sold off. This is an important message here in, I'm sorry, I'm going off again, but this is an important message here in Tennessee. Because what this book is really talking about is the crime within the crimes, massive crime of enslavement, but the less talked about crime of the domestic slave trade. And how many black people have their origins in Virginia but ended up in places like, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, etc. And they didn't go there obviously by choice. They went there because they were being sold. And in most of those sales, what was involved was the destruction of a family. And I really wanted us to sit with this for a moment. A historian was telling me the other day, some 40% of African Americans have an ancestor they can trace back to Virginia. That is a shocking testimony. Because we talk to black people, they say, my family's from Mississippi, my family's from Tennessee, my family's from Alabama. Like, we have almost, if you think about it, we think we know, but we've actually forgotten that we were, even here in this United States, from somewhere else very often before we got to the place that we think we're from. And the way we got there was through the commission of a great crime. It's been erased because it's underneath an even larger, greater crime. And so I was really trying to take us, back there. We think we know, but maybe we don't.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some part that we've forgotten.
And I think that's made evident in the relationship between Hiram and Thina. I'm not going to try to spoil too much, but it's very early on in the novel, so don't get mad at me. But Hiram's orphaned very early, and he finds Thina, who's lost 5 kids, and they're not bounded by blood, but by loss. And Thina reminds me of a lot of black mothers in my family. My mom's not here, so I can say this, but very stern. I think black mother love is a little bit different, and Thina loves Hiram a little bit differently. And it reminded me of Sula when Hannah's kind of talking to Eva and saying, "Did you love us?" And she's like, "Love you." She's like, "Are you alive?" And so, but how that sense of family is made different, and especially how marginalized communities make our own family. I think is really made evident in the book.
And he knows it, even though he can't. So, like, one of the rapper on Thina, she lives, all the enslaved community that works, in the tobacco fields, they live in this area that they call the street. And Thina is thought to be the meanest woman on the street. That's what they call her. And, when the kids are playing in front of her, little cabin, she comes out with the broom and swats them away. You know what I mean? And is always talking about somebody and has something to say. But when he's orphaned, as you say, the first place he goes is to Thina. And the reason why he goes there is he knows that this woman has lost 5 kids. They have taken her children. Her husband has passed away. They've taken her children and sold them on the racetrack, literally on a racetrack. And unlike a lot of the other enslaved community that's there, that if only to survive just buries that pain. In much the same way Hiram actually buries the pain, Thina will not forget. And her anger is the representation of her insistence that she not forget her kids, that she not forget what was done, and if she's resentful of the rest of the community, it's because she feels like that they should be angry. And that anger actually is the maternal attraction for Hiram. Because even at that moment, he knows that there's something deeply true about her. And her thing with him is that he not forget.
She reminds him, she's like, don't forget, that's not your family. That's not your family, You've talked a little bit about research, but I kind of want to circle back to that. One of my favorite writers and poets is Robin Cost Lewis, and she talks about research as a form of devotion. And when I was reading this book, it so reminded me of so many slave narratives that I read. You've already mentioned Frederick Douglass, but Alado Equiano and Harriet Ann Jacobs with Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. And I wanted to know if you can kind of give us a fuller picture of some of the other primary and secondary sources that you encountered, things that were maybe, even though you already knew some of the history, that there were some surprising facts. And also a craft question. I know I loaded my questions, but so there's that part.
It's all right, it's okay.
And then I know there's writers in the audience, but it's so hard when you find all this research, and then how do you artfully weave it into the book and not weight it down, because it read so gorgeously and seamlessly that we weren't weighted down by all these facts.
Well, that's what editors are for, right?
Yeah, that's true.
In the first place, you don't think about that. You just, throw in what you feel like you need to throw in, and then the editors just, if you got good ones, they help you prune it back. I mean, I was researching up until, like the last days I was writing. So you're talking about 10 years of stuff. I don't know, man. I read about like horse racing. I didn't know how many enslaved people were jockeys. There's a racetrack scene in here, but I probably imagined it a different way. At the time, I thought it was going to be like a more prominent than it ended up being. And that's okay. It's things you research, and you have to know it all the way through, whether you are going to use it, whether you end up using it or not. You can't shortcut that process. It's like a test, right? Like it might be on the test, you just don't know. You know what I mean? So you got to study like it's going to be on the test.
Yeah.
There was that. Oh my God, I read a ton about women's fashion. So basically, white women's fashion in the antebellum period. I know too much about that.
Yeah, there were some crinolines, some bonnets.
Yeah, which was a word I literally did not know before I started. The men and how the men in that period used to wear black waistcoats and the top hat, or like little dumb stuff like that. The brogans, even and then the fashion among enslaved people. The fact that they had this rough cloth. It was actually literally called Austinenberg, but they would call it Negro cloth because it was only given to black people. It was only fit for black people.
I remember I looked it up, and it's a very rough fabric.
Yes,
yeah.
extremely. Yes, yeah. Exactly. The dancing, which is actually where the title comes from. The music of the time, as you mentioned, there were work songs in there, which are derived from actual work songs that I came across. The way you, see, it's too much. The very process I have literal video where I had a guy at Monticello, and I had said to him, I said, okay, take me through every step for how you raise a tobacco plant.
Oh, wow.
And he went through the whole thing. And then I went to another dude and did the same thing. And that boiled down to like one paragraph. Like the video is probably collectively about 20 minutes. And it ended up as just one paragraph in the book.
But again, it goes back to those details, because I think one of the slaves is in charge of the apple orchard at Lafayette.
Yes.
And it's kind of bookended, because we start with all of the attention that he has of
Yes.
pruning and cutting. And then at the end, when that slave is gone,
Yes.
it's kind of haunting at the end. And even though it's a tiny detail, it's those textures, that matter.
Yeah, you get attached to stuff, man. Even like minor characters like that, when they go, like you really miss them,
Speaking of music, I recently saw you on Desus and Mero talking about the novel. It's a really great interview. But you mentioned that rappers were a main influence on your writing. And I love this idea, one, of kind of expanding notions of what the traditional Western literary canon is. Basically it's full of a bunch of dead white dudes.
Right.
So I love that you're adding rappers to the canon, but also the novel read so musical to me and so lyrical, not just because there's work songs in there, but your actual sentences felt like I wanted to read them aloud. And I also note, if you get the audiobook, which I also listened to, Joe Morton is the narrator, and he actually sings some of the work songs, so I highly suggest that you check that out.
It's beautiful.
But I wanted to know kind of what your relationship was to kind of, what your relationship to kind of how music influenced your writing, and so much of the call and response. And there's actually one section in there where it kind of sounded like that rap hype man that's in the background that's kind of using that repetition and kind of like hyping it forward.
That's where I got it from, by the way. No, you're exactly right. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I got it from this Tribe Called Quest song, Scenario, and I kept listening to it over and over again, and that was like my influence.
Yeah.
That section's like about Harriet Tubman, but that was what I was thinking. I was thinking of Tribe Called Quest and Leaders of the New School, actually. No, I mean, it's the first real literature I knew, and it was actually what I wanted to be. I mean, I can remember being, 11? No, not even that old. I mean, I guess, like 10, 11, and I guess hearing Rakim for the first time and being like, well, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
Like, whatever he's doing, I need to go do that.
Yeah.
And then going off to college and Nas coming out and just feeling like, wow, like what? Like this is, I mean, I listened to it. I had a party with some friends the other day, man. And, we were listening to it. And all of us were going through like what we felt, in our gut. Like, the first time we heard like New York State of Mind. And whatever that feeling was, ever since I, started really, really writing, because I was writing at the time, I was writing poetry at that point, I have been trying to make people feel like that. Like I felt when I first heard New York State of Mind. You know what I mean? And it's a feeling that escapes words. It's a feeling actually somebody saying something and you feeling like you're actually there. But even in being there, you see more than what you would actually see were you there, because it's them, it's their eyes. And they're akin, they're attuned to all of the, the small tragedies that are happening, in a moment. There's a part in that song And he's in this shootout, and he runs into basically the project lobby. And the lobby's like full of kids. And he's a kid at the time that he's singing. He's like 18, 19 years old. He's not a particularly older person. But it's filled with kids, but the kids are not innocent kids. They're kids who are drug dealing like him, who are basically his competition. But he doesn't say all of that. Like, it's like 2 bars, right? But you get it. Yeah. And to be able to, and you getting that, like, the entire tragedy of the situation. Like, it adds an extra level to the fact that he's shooting out, with these folks outside the project. To be able to do that in about, 15 or 20 words, I mean, that's pretty exceptional. Yeah. And, like, that was the level that I was really trying to get at. That's the level I always try to get. That's what I was trying to get at with Between the World and Me. I mean, with everything, I'm always trying to get on that. It's not much different than poetry. You know what I mean? Like it was why I was happy as a writer that poetry was the first thing I did, even though I wasn't very good at it. Because what they're trying to get you to do is cram as much feeling and emotion and experience into as few words as you possibly can. You're aiming for a kind of, efficiency.
Yeah, there's a distillation that's happening.
That's right. And I've very much tried to carry that over into my nonfiction and into my fiction.
Yeah, I'm a little worried because I'm a poet, because I'm like, what's next? Are you coming for?
No. Poetry, man, it's for me, I mean, and I don't know, sometimes, like, part of it is, I'll just tell you this, and you'll get this. One of my great friends I went to school with is a poet, up in Pittsburgh, Yona Harvey. Mm-hmm. And we, went to school together. We were both poets at the same time. And we got this idea. And one of our mentors was this guy, Joel Diaz-Porter, who was a great poet at the time too, right? Mm-hmm. So we all got this idea that we were going to apply to Provincetown Workshop, right? Yusef Kumunyaka was teaching a workshop. And I adored Yusef Kumunyaka. I still do, you know what I mean? And we get up there, so it's myself, Yona, Joel Diaz-Porter, and it's Terrence Hayes, who's just this young dude at the time. We're all friends. Like, we're all hanging out. Man, I got in that workshop, and I did that for a week, and I was like, nah, bro. This ain't you. You know what I mean? This ain't you. You are a really, really good basketball player, but you're not going pro. Yeah. Like, you're not. Yeah. You know what I mean? You might win a college championship, but you are not a lottery pick. Like, you're not even, or even a draft pick, to be honest with you. Yeah. And I just, but sometimes I wonder, like, knowing now how art actually works, and knowing that talent had a season, like, it's actually not a straight line like this. You know what I mean? Like, things happen, you go through life, you live. I always wonder, like, what would have happened if I had stuck with it? But I'm not going back. Yeah, okay. Because it was too hard. It's a really, really hard art form.
I mean, I think it goes back to that idea what you're talking about, failure. And I think Monk has that quote of just like, I'm always practicing, and that idea that even though you started the poetry, that distillation, that ear to language, that ear to prosody, that ear to imagery and metaphor, that's still prevalent, that attention to anaphora and repetition is in your work still, those fingerprints,
Thank you.
But you mentioned...
To this day, too, like when I teach, I always start with poetry. It's the first thing. I teach like nonfiction, you know what I mean? I teach this class at NYU, writing for reporters, but we start with poetry first. I always start them there, because I want them to understand sentences and what they're trying to do,
Absolutely. Yeah. Was a poet, I love that, yeah. I heard some finger snaps, so you mentioned Harriet Tubman, so I didn't know if we could talk about her.
Yeah, I mean, it's been in all the reviews.
Okay. So there's, a character Moses in the book, which is like an homage to Harriet Tubman, and also the biopic's out, so it seems really timely right now that your book's coming out and the film. Why did you want to incorporate her story? And she has an interesting quote that I pulled out that kind of haunted me, and she says, "To forget is to truly slave, to forget is to die." And I'd love to hear you talk about Moses, but also what have we forgotten, and what do we keep forgetting now in our society?
A lot. No, I had made this, I think at one point, I was like, I had figured out that the Underground Railroad was in this book, right? Yeah. And then I started, going back and, reading, like, biographies and histories and everything. And I remember I was reading one of the biographies, and it was, a relatively recently written one. And the biographer said, we can't even retrace every escape she made. And so, like, as a writer, you immediately become curious when somebody says something like that, right? Because that's the point where imagination jumps off. And it probably was my rooting in comic books at that point that, decided what I was going to do with that. And I can't particularly reconstruct how that notion became tied to memory, except to say that I was always interested in that, you know. But I don't know, man. I mean, I'm from Baltimore, you know what I mean? My family's from the Eastern Shore. Harriet Tubman's from the, Eastern Shore, Maryland, and so it really felt like a natural thing to do. You know, the hardest thing was like, I just didn't want her to be stiff.
Yeah.
Once again, like it's this idea, how do you draw the human out of that? And, I think like that story of her pulling the gun on the dude really stuck with me. I think I had this idea, this is somebody, who really just don't take no stuff. Like this woman is not playing.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wrote in that way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I just kind of combined that with a little Obi-Wan Kenobi. And
Yeah.
got Harriet Tubman. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. We bring her to life, and it's a really fascinating section. We have some audience questions, but I want to ask just one more question.
Sure.
It's going to be a little bit clunky, but if you'll help me.
Okay.
There's a character I really want to discuss, and I don't know how we can discuss her without spoiling anything, so I'm going to try my best.
Okay.
I won't say her name, but there's a white woman abolitionist in the novel who's a pretty complicated, kind of iconoclastic figure. And to me, she kind of read as like the seemingly woke white woman. And I put woke in quotation marks, because I think it's being woke is fraught. And she kind of complicates that notion of freedom in the novel, and she says, but freedom, true freedom, is a master too. You see one more dogged, more constant than any ragged slave driver. She said, what you must now accept is that all of us are bound by something. Some will bind themselves to property in man, and not all comes forthwith, and others shall bind themselves to justice. All must name a master to serve. All must choose.
I think she was right. Like, I thought that was like one of her moments of clarity. I mean, there are other things that are not
As
you know,
good, yeah.
that are not, that are clearly like, you know what I mean? But I thought that was one of the moments where she had it.
Okay.
What do you think? I mean, I can see why it could be disturbing, right? Because she's equating that with actual slavery, right?
Yeah. Well, I think she's complicating freedom in the Underground Railroad, and that she has her own aims that are kind of this aerial view that are higher than the movement, and she's not seeing individual free people.
Yes.
And it reminds me of how there's well-meaning white folk.
Right.
Some are probably here.
Right.
And but that often sometimes, you talked about tripping, that trip and say problematic things for the movement.
And you thought that was problematic?
Well, I think the notion of freedom, that you always have to, that one is not truly free.
Right.
And even you talk about in the novel and with the Underground, even when people do get north, that living free is another kind of concept.
Yeah.
I don't know, she was just a very complicated figure that I was trying to kind of figure out, and that how do we rub that tension in the movement with, I don't know, the abolitionists. I don't know, she was very complicated for me in an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the history though.
Yeah.
I mean, and they were like that,
Yeah.
and I just think it's difficult, man. I mean, I think, I don't know, I mean, it's, in this time, in this woke time, which I think is awesome, by the way, because I'm just going to say this, and you can feel free to disagree. I lived in a time where people ain't give a about being woke. Like, I've seen the other side, where, like, well-meaning white people is a problem, but, like, I have lived in a time where it was mostly, like, ill-meaning white people, like, just didn't... You know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm talking about like at the universities. Like, I understand this is not, hasn't spread everywhere, but like I can like very well remember like when they just didn't care. Like, this is an upgrade.
Yeah.
And I think like what people like should understand is in life there are no like you don't get an upgrade and have no problems.
That's fair.
Like, there's no this is better and all my problems are now solved. You know what I mean? The best you can hope for is a better problem. And it's not like... So it's not like woke white people aren't a problem, like woke men, are a problem, or, woke straight people are a problem. Yeah. Like, we're problems, right? We're all problems, right? But that's a better problem to have. You understand? Than ill-meaning men, ill-meaning, I just don't, I'm not even trying to, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's fair.
So having said that, that does not make one immune from critique though, right? Like, that doesn't mean, you just understand, there are levels, right? That's what you get to. So, I mean, it's always, like, it's hard. I mean, it's extremely it's like cliche, and I kind of get annoyed when people say this, but it is, because people always say this when they want to ask me a question. Like white people want to ask me a question, they say, I can never know what it means. And I just want to ask the fucking question. Come on, I get it. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to do this choreography. I don't need you to acknowledge it. Just ask the question. Let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
You know, but I get it, right? Because the fact of the matter is, though, like, I can be in as much sympathy as I want with, say, the Me Too movement, right? Mm-hmm. But my experience is like coming of age as a young person in New York, going to parties and being able to get drunk and fall asleep drunk on the train and not worry about somebody feeling me up. Mm-hmm. That's my experience. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And you can like unfold that and, you know, pull that out, mm-hmm. you know, to my entire experience growing up in Baltimore. Baltimore was a very, very violent place in the time that I was growing up. And so I have the experience of worrying about my body. But I don't have the experience of worrying about somebody doing something to my body and on top of that being this private shame that I don't want to talk about, I don't want to. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. Like I don't have that. Mm-hmm. And so you can't really get to that place with somebody. Yeah. You know, you can empathize, you can sympathize, you can listen to them. You know, and so what that means is like, you know, in the case of the person you're talking about, as you say, they had the luxury of being real abstract. They don't have a specific relative or person that they're thinking about, that they have in mind, or let alone themselves that they're actually thinking about. They don't have that. They're not tied in the same way. And so that's a definite complication. Yeah. You know what I mean? But, you know, once again, what you want in life is you want your choice of problems. Yeah. You know, because there's going to be problems. Yeah. You know, it's going to be problems.
Yeah, thank you. And also, we didn't get to it, but I think you do a great job with giving agency to women in the story, and especially Sophia's story in the possession of her own body. So thank you for...
No, I appreciate that. And I'll just say that could not have been done alone. Mm-hmm. You know, I was, people, you know, once again, you know, we are in a time where people are like, why do we need diversity? Why do we need this? And I don't really understand that. Because if you're going to write, I mean, there's like these writers, man. Oh, I can imagine myself as a Pakistani carpenter, you know what I mean, who, you know, wife died after 20 years. I mean, you can. Yeah. I'm not saying you can't. Yeah. But I would want to talk to a Pakistani carpenter given the opportunity. I would take that. Yeah. I would take that. You know what I mean? Not even out of politeness to Pakistani carpenters, although there's that too, but just out of, I'd want to know. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to just imagine a plantation. I want to go. Mm-hmm. I want to see it. You know, that would, and so I think like the same thing holds for these experiences, you know, like there were going to be obviously enslaved women in this book. And so it probably behooved me to have readers who were directly connected to that experience in a way that I was not. Mm-hmm. You know, because once again, I'm a dude who could fall asleep drunk on the train, right? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so what you want is people who can bring input that don't, you know what I mean, that don't necessarily have a different lens than yours. I mean, I know a lot of people, again, you know, in this time, well, can white people write about this? White people can write about whatever they want. They just need to respect it. Yeah. It's real simple, you know? And so what I was trying to do is respecting it for that, what that meant was having a community of readers that hailed from the community I was actually writing about.
Yeah, it's important. Okay, now for the readers' questions, and it's Kanye time.
Okay.
I am a big fan of your 2018 article regarding Kanye West. Any new feelings about his new Jesus is King album?
No, I haven't listened. It's hard, man, you know, and I'm not even boycotting. I just, Oh, wow. Wow. It's not good? Oh, man. You know, I actually kind of thought that, though. I thought it might not be good, and I'll tell you why. Because, like, even when I wrote the essay, he did that thing where he released, like, 5 albums over the summer, and I listened to most of them, and they weren't trash, but they sounded like, I mean, they were rushed. Yeah. You know what I mean? Here you got Kanye and Nas, and I was like, wow, this is a Kanye-produced Nas album. I mean, it wasn't good. I mean, it wasn't good. even the Pusha T, which people really, really liked, I mean, I just felt like, okay, but, you know what I mean? This is a dude whose talent is just, and I just, I feel bad, man. I really feel bad because I think like one of the, and the key or the trick of writing that article was how do you hold this dude account, but not drag him out and just beat the shit out of him, right? Which was, I mean, I was having it on Twitter. I'm not saying that's wrong, but if you're gonna write, you know what I mean? You got to like try to give us at least some idea of what this feels like from the outside, but what he might be thinking, right? And what I understood was the following. What I understood was though on a much, much smaller level, had a thing that I love to do. Like Kanye presumably loves to make music. I love to write. That thing had made me more famous than anything I had ever expected or anything I could have ever dreamed of. And I imagine, it's the same for him, even though he probably would say it's not. I don't know how he imagines, the life he has now or how he would have. And again, like I said, you know what I mean? There are no, unadulterated, unvarnished joys. There are always problems that come with things. And for me, it was complicated by the fact that it wasn't like fame was not actually what I was aiming for. I wanted the respect of, my peers. That was really what I wanted. I wanted, my fellow writers to feel like when I walked in the room, they were like, and what happened was something much more than that. And then that brought a bunch of problems. Now, I was quite fortunate, because it didn't happen at the level that it happened to him, okay? But in addition to that, I had such a tight community. I had that HBCU experience, right? All of my...
In the Mecca, yeah.
And so that's what I'm talking about though, right?
Yeah.
So everywhere I've gone, just about 90% of these events, and we're getting into our 20s in terms of, like, I've had that experience. There's somebody out there that recognizes, right? So I got community everywhere I go. My closest friends come from that community. I'm tight with my family. You understand what I'm saying? So I have, like, shields against, even though a lot of it was difficult, I have people that keep me centered. If I'm off, they're going to tell me. Ain't nobody scared of me. You know what I mean? These are not people that are eating off of me. You know what I mean? They got their own thing going on. That preserves you.
Yeah.
And he ain't got none of that. And I fear for that man.
Yeah.
I really, really, really fear for that man. Because when can't nobody tell you anything, that's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough. You know what I mean? So I just imagine him, out there in Calabasas, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And how many people do you have who knew you before you were Kanye? How many of those people are around you? How many people, are, and I just, that's tough. That's a really, really tough place to be in. So, to the extent that I just feel bad. I felt bad at the time. I feel bad now.
Yeah.
Because I think black folks, he's doing harm, but I think black folks going to be all right. We're going to be fine.
Yeah.
We survive worse than Kanye.
Yeah.
So. But is Kanye going to be fine? You mentioned
Twitter, and so another question: are you glad you left social media?
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm still on Instagram though.
You're on IG.
Yeah, I'm on IG, which is a different. As I'm sure some of y'all know, it's a very different interaction. I think the ability to come up with a thought on your phone and immediately hit it and tell the world, like that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
That was not good. Even IG actually slows you down a little bit, right? Because you have to have like a picture or something. So it forces like you have to do other things. You can't just think of something and just, you know what I'm saying? And you can't even though you can regram, you can't instantly retweet in the same way. Like it maybe not intentionally, it actually slows you up a little bit in a way that Twitter just doesn't. People just talk.
Yeah.
And they talk as though what they're talking about and what they're saying is not recorded forever.
It's an archive, yeah.
So, no, I shouldn't have been there in the first place. It was always bad. I can't think of one. For me, I'm not speaking for everybody, but for me, I can't think of a real redeeming feature.
Yeah. How accurate do you believe Baldwin's predictions were and the racial forecast of America. And I actually had a Baldwin quote in here from Giovanni's room of home is not a place but an irrevocable condition, which made me think about from your novel too. So I'm going to slip that in there.
So the one that I think about, and this is probably the one that, so obviously I love Baldwin, you know what I mean? I think he was the finest essayist, of the 20th century at least, perhaps finest American essayist ever. He had that efficiency that I'm talking about. Like he could just, push so much into a sentence. And I'm still chasing that, myself. I think we probably diverge in our sense of the country and probably our sense of white people and our sense of power. And I think that's because even though he turned away from the church, he was raised in the church. And so probably the power of love and the idea meant more to him than it means to me. I love the fire. Again, I love the fire next time. It inspired Between the World and Me. But probably at the end, where he, talks about how, we basically have to love white people into the future. I can't do that. I just don't have that. I have respect. I have I don't have hate. But I don't, I think like a lot of this, and this is not just for Baldwin, I think this is like for a large swath of me and Black America, my own community. I'm kind of distanced because I didn't grow up in the church. So I don't understand like forgiveness. I don't get it. I don't quite get the power, and I'm sure it's there. You know what I mean? If I had a different tradition and if I was raised very differently, I don't get somebody doing something to you and you forgiving them. I don't understand it. I understand it's an extreme example, but I don't understand a cop shooting your brother and then you hugging the person. I don't have that. But it's clear but that's a thing. That's a thing. It happens so much that it's clear it's a thing. I don't understand it forgiving Dylan Roof. I'm fuck Dylan Roof. You know what I mean? Like that's how I feel. I understand being against the death penalty in that case because you oppose the death penalty and you understand what, you know what I mean? And I'm not talking about vengeance. I think there's a place between vengeance and, forgiveness. I think there's a place between hate and love. And I think about this even like with Martin Luther King. It's possibly like it's just something I'm missing, right? I haven't come to but I don't get it, man. I don't see much evidence that in forgiving white people, being loving towards white people, which is just another word for power. So I would substitute any other group in there, by the way. That doesn't strike me as a force that moves, people and moves history. So I probably have a much darker view of how power works. I think power respects power, and the moments, in Black history where you actually see progress, it is because, and very often because of, things outside of ourselves, you know what I mean? Events outside of ourselves that happened and we were trying to leverage, and folks had to respect it, but I think that's probably, he probably was a bigger believer in the power of love as a healing force, and I don't have that.
What advice would you give young, aspiring writers who want to write on issues of slavery and race?
Oh, I mean, once again, I would give them the same advice that I would give white people that want to write about Black people. Respect your subject. Just show some respect. You know what I mean? Don't sit on your ass and try to imagine, And I know that's controversial because a lot of novelists actually do that. I'm just not a fan of that, I think you should respect folks and why you are, feel yourself connected to it, as a Black person, born, within this experience, you should understand that these people were very, very different from you. And you should do your best to understand them, and then you should put all of that research and thinking in a drawer, and you should go try to write. But I think the first part is really, really important.
Yeah. That's my last question. Naming becomes really important. We see that in Between the World and Me, we have the dreamers. And in this book, we have the world of the quality and the world of the tasked, the enslaved and the slavers. Why was it important for you to create this new lexicon, this new language, these new monikers for how we see and understand the slavery system?
Yeah, I always do that because I think I'm I guess not even thinking about it. I just feel like, one of the things I often say is, white supremacy is bad enough, But then on top of that, people try to gaslight you. And they try to act like it's not happening. You know what I mean? And that it's actually your fault, and this is you know what I mean? And so one large aspect in getting free is just figuring out, no, this actually really is happening. But then once you realize that and you see it all around you, it's like the words are no longer appropriate anymore. And so there's a part in Between the World and Me where I talk about, can I shout out the sound, man, by the way? We have had trouble with sound everywhere I've gone, and this has been flawless and great, so thank you. Give it up for the sound, man. I don't know where he is, but thank you. In Between the World and Me is this whole part, where I try to talk about, all of these words that we use, race relations. That's the one that really, gets me. Even, I would argue, even in the book, I argue, even the term white people itself, as though it's a thing, a real thing that's somehow, in the bones. These are words that obscure the evil of what's actually happening. And so I'm always, because if the whole thing is a lie, how can you accept the vocabulary? So I'm always, I think, in search of new, vocabulary to name the condition. Again, just to take it back to hip-hop, that's the most beautiful thing. These guys construct an entire, derived from the language that we ourselves construct, to describe the reality. And so often it just feels so much truer to the situation. I was with Terry Jones yesterday, and we were talking about words, the same question. She was talking about the word conversate, right? And she was like, conversate is not to converse. It's not even to have a conversation. It's not to talk to. It means a particular thing. It describes a reality that we were struggling to describe until somebody said conversate. And it was like, that's it. That's the true way to express what's going on here between me and you. Conversate, that's it. And I just feel like, when you're talking about black folks in this country, so often we just don't have our conversate yet. We don't have our right word yet. And so, I think, in the water dance and In Between the World and Me, it's the search for those right words.
Yeah. Well, thank you for conversating with me tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's give it up for Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.